Spiritual awakening is not an achievement, it's a reminder, a silent call that arises when the soul tires of pretending to be just human. You feel something shift, not outside, but inside. Things lose their shine, people sound distant, and time seems to slow down, as if the world were breathing along with you. It is subtle, almost imperceptible, but irreversible. You begin to see what was always there, the shadow behind kindness, the fear behind strength, the ego behind good intentions. And understand that awakening is not about becoming new, but about remembering what always was, before the masks, before the rush, before the noise. Carl Jung called this the return to the self, the point at which the spirit hears its own voice again. It's a slow, sometimes messy, always transformative process. There is no light without shadow, no expansion without silence. And perhaps it is precisely in this silence that you realize awakening does not begin with answers, but with the right kind of questions. If this resonates within you, stay here, because sometimes listening is the most profound way to wake up. There's a silent moment after spiritual awakening when you believe you've arrived. Your mind whispers, "This is it, the top." You feel an almost insolent peace, as if chaos has surrendered to your new perspective. But soon the ego, wounded not dead, dresses itself in light and returns disguised as humility. It tells you that now you are different, special, enlightened, and that's exactly where the true test begins, because enlightenment isn't a prize, it's a dismantling. It's when the self tears you from your spiritual comfort and forces you to look at the shadow that survived the ecstasy. What seemed like the end of the journey is, in fact, the beginning of disorder. The summit is just the first step into the abyss, and the soul, naive, still believes that awakening would bring peace, when, in fact, it only brought lucidity, and lucidity hurts. In the first few days after this soul expansion, everything seems miraculously aligned. Coincidences multiply, signs haunt you, and each breath seems to contain a revelation. But soon, life returns the broken mirror, the clogged sink, the toxic colleague, the need disguised as compassion. The ego tries to deny the fall, calls chaos a test, tries to sustain the persona of the awakened. It is in this friction that the real work begins, abandoning the fantasy of transcendence and descending into humanity. Reading Jung is to understand that the divine does not eliminate the human, it intensifies it. And when consciousness expands, suffering does not disappear, it merely changes its appearance. The search now is not for relief, but for truth. And truth, almost always, is uncomfortable. If you truly want to experience awakening, stop romanticizing the light and learn to endure the darkness it reveals. It's easy to talk about spirituality while the ego still feels in control. What's difficult is when inner silence begins to unmask the arrogance disguised as peace, when the spiritual self becomes a new prison. At this point, many fall back asleep, confusing comfort with evolution. But those who remain, who accept losing control and continuing to descend, find something more real than happiness. They find the self that promises not rest, but presence. The self that offers not heaven, but depth. It is there, between the fall and the call, that true awakening begins to whisper, and the next collapse approaches. Every time consciousness expands, something dies silently. And almost always, what dies are the relationships that once sustained you. It's inevitable. Spiritual awakening doesn't just change you, it changes your frequency. And this disrupts the invisible agreements that kept you connected to others. Carl Jung said that individuation is a process of separation from the crowd, and therefore it's lonely. You begin to realize that many of your bonds were born not of love, but of necessity. That your friendships were built on the fear of being alone, and your loves on the refusal to see yourself fully. The self begins to disintegrate these fragile alliances, one by one, and when this happens, the mind panics, because it confuses loss with failure. But in truth, it's purification. Each separation is a form of energetic cleansing. Each silence is an invitation to reconnect with who you truly are. The ego suffers when it realizes that the old circle no longer understands it. It tries to revive dead friendships, save relationships that have rotted under the light of consciousness. You try to explain what you feel, try to share what you've seen, but words fail. It's like trying to describe the ocean to someone who only knows puddles. The other person's eyes are lost, and the heart feels the cut. That's when the soul begins to bleed. Jung observed that true awakening dissolves the invisible contracts that sustain masks. You begin to see clearly how much your bonds depended on your persona, and when it falls, everything collapses with it. People aren't rejecting your new self, they're resisting their own transformation, and the lesson is hard. You can't save a relationship that needs your unconsciousness to exist. Let die what needs to die. Don't try to negotiate with the past. Spirituality isn't about maintaining connections, but about mourning who you once were. When a bond is severed, something within you also breaks. And it's this fracture that allows light to enter. The soul doesn't want company, it wants truth. And truth, almost always, comes with goodbyes. It's in this empty space between end and rebirth that inner silence begins to grow. Loneliness isn't punishment, it's the womb of the new. But what comes after this death isn't relief. It's the return of something even older, darker, and infinitely more real. You thought you'd conquered the darkness, didn't you? That spiritual awakening would free you from the pain, the shadows, the abysses. But what Jung discovered, and few have the courage to admit, is that the shadow doesn't die with the light. It merely changes form. The dark night of the soul isn't a one-time event. It's a cycle. It returns always, like an inevitable tide. And each return is deeper, quieter, more personal. The first plunge makes you see your traumas. The second makes you feel the traumas of your blood, of your parents, of your ancestors. The third is almost unbearable. It's the weight of the collective shadow of the world's pain piercing your body. You wake up one day not knowing whether you're sad for something of your own or for something that belongs to humanity. This is where the expansion of your soul demands courage, because awakening isn't about escaping pain, but learning to inhabit it without running away. In these phases, the ego tries to rationalize hell. It calls relapse what is actually descent. It tries to illuminate the abyss with pretty phrases, with mantras, with forced gratitude. But the soul doesn't want comfort. It wants truth. And the truth is that there are days when light serves no purpose other than revealing the extent of the darkness. Jung said that those who look outside dream, but those who look inside awaken. And it is within that the swamp dwells. The shadow pulls you to revisit old pains, to revisit who you were before you became conscious. It is the self tearing you from the stage of performative spirituality and pushing you to the cold ground of psychic reality. What you feel is disorientation, emptiness, disconnection. But the void, when accepted, begins to speak. It whispers what the ego is afraid to hear, that the dark is also sacred. During these times, everything that is easy abandons you. Sleep flees. Faith vanishes, meaning evaporates. It is the final purification, not of the world, but of the gaze. If you want to cross, don't resist. Walk as if walking through fire with your eyes open. Stop looking for shortcuts and accept the collapse. Breathe in the midst of it. Walking in conscious darkness is what differentiates the awakened from the superficial mystic. It is what transforms pain into consciousness. Reading Jung, meditating in silence, writing down what emerges, all of these help. but nothing replaces the raw confrontation with hell itself. And when you believe there is nothing left to lose, something new begins to be born. The ability to see the sacred even in the profane. But this, ironically, will bring another weight, the weight of meaning in everything. After darkness comes light, but it is not light, it is heavy. Because when consciousness awakens, the veil tears, and nothing is banal anymore. Breakfast becomes a ritual, traffic becomes a metaphor, touch becomes language. Everything seems to speak to you constantly. It's as if the self has opened the eyes of the soul, and now you see the invisible web connecting all things. But this spiritual sensitivity, if left untamed, consumes you. The ego tries to transform every gesture into meaning, every event into a sign, until the sacred becomes a burden. Jung warned, the danger of the enlightened is to drown in their own light. When everything is a message, nothing is simple. When everything is a symbol, the soul is exhausted. And life, which was once a temple, becomes a labyrinth. Spirituality without anchoring is an overdose of meaning. You begin to see God in the chaos of the supermarket, feel the universe in every breath, and wonder why the world seems to ignore the obvious miracle of existence. The problem is that the body was not made to live in a permanent state of transcendence. It needs matter, routine, oblivion. The self teaches you that true spirituality is not about being elevated all the time, but knowing when to descend. Learning to turn off the mystical gaze and simply wash the dishes. Eating without meditating on the cosmic origin of wheat. Speaking without translating each word into an archetype. It is the return to simplicity that balances the awakened. Jung said that man needs both bread and symbols, but the symbol, without bread, becomes delirium. The expansion of the soul needs ground, otherwise it fragments. The discipline is different now. It's no longer about seeking the sacred, but learning to live with it. The soul doesn't want you to lose yourself in contemplation. It wants you to function without losing consciousness. This alternation is an art, a form of spiritual breathing, inhaling the divine, exhaling the human. This is what prevents consciousness from swallowing you. Try practicing normalcy as if it were meditation. Walk without purpose, breathe without interpreting. Read Jung but also laugh at something silly, cook. Hug someone without trying to heal them. Balance lies in being spiritual without being unbearable. But when you learn to deal with this duality, another challenge arises, the gift that manifests and begins to hurt. When consciousness expands, the body becomes an antenna. You begin to feel what no one else feels, hear what goes unspoken, capture vibrations that permeate the air like invisible currents. And what many call a spiritual gift, Jung would call it the expansion of the psyche, comes not as a blessing, but as a rupture. Suddenly, you feel a stranger's sadness in your chest. Perceive the falsehood between the lines, and grasp humanity's collective pain without meaning to. The ego tries to transform this into power, but the self shows you, sensitivity without structure is torture. The awakened soul was not made to carry everyone's weight. It must learn to discern what is its own and what belongs to another. This is the true learning of empathy, to feel without losing oneself, and the price of this gift is high. It demands emotional maturity, not just spiritual expansion. At first, the sensitive person believes they are going mad. Every environment seems to scream. Every gaze weighs heavily. Every energy touches. It is the psychic chaos of openness. Jung saw this in patients who confused enlightenment with mediumship, intuition with paranoia, perception with invasion. Spirituality without discernment is a minefield, and here the advice is practical. If the gift overwhelms you, ground yourself. Take care of your body, your sleep, your food. Practice inner silence like cleaning a telescope lens, because without silence even light blinds. Take walks, work with your hands, release energy and movement. Not every revelation is meant to be absorbed. Some need to be released. Awakening without a body is vertigo. The soul needs skin to remain human. Over time, the gift begins to mature. Sensitivity becomes a tool. Intuition is organized. Perception is refined. You learn to choose when to open and when to close, when to listen and when to remain silent. The gift ceases to be a wound and becomes a bridge, but it never stops hurting. It's the pain of seeing too much, of feeling the invisible, of perceiving the suffering the world ignores. It's the price of being awake on a sleeping planet. Jung said that the true healer is the one who bleeds with you, but doesn't drown. And that's the lesson. Feeling is inevitable. Suffering is a choice. When you learn to let the flow pass through you without possessing you, the gift becomes a channel. But consciousness, cruelly, still holds another test. The silence that comes when even the gift becomes lonely. There comes a point when the expansion of the soul isolates you from everything that once made sense. You are no longer alone, you are beyond. Loneliness after spiritual awakening is not the absence of people, it is the absence of equivalence. You begin to see the world in colors few can see, and this condemns you to a kind of silent exile. Jung called this the loneliness of expanded consciousness. It's the pain of perceiving reality while everyone else is still dreaming. You try to share what you feel, but no one understands. They talk about goals, status, possessions, and you only see emptiness. The ego tries to convince you there's something wrong with you, but it's the opposite. It's the world that still sleeps. The self isolated you not as punishment, but to teach you to hear what only reveals itself in silence. This is where spirituality ceases to be a search and becomes survival. The human within you cries out for connection. It wants to be seen, heard, understood. But every attempt feels superficial, every conversation feels like a rehearsal. You begin to realize that most relationships are made of noise, not presence. Then the self teaches you a new way to love, without necessity. You learn to find companionship in the wind, in the bird song, in the morning light streaming through the window. You learn to converse with the inner silence as if speaking to an old sage. And slowly you discover that solitude is not absence, but total presence. Jung said that the true individual is the one who has learned to be alone without feeling separated. And this changes everything, because the soul, once expanded, understands that there is more truth in the silence of a tree than in the promises of a crowd. But don't romanticize this phase. There are nights when the emptiness hurts so much your body trembles. There are days when you beg for a gaze that recognizes you, and it is in this pain that spiritual humility is born, when you realize that not even consciousness saves you from the human condition. You are vast, yet you still long for comfort. You are light, yet you still bleed. This contradiction is what keeps you real. And, paradoxically, the more awake you become, the harder it is to fit in. The self doesn't want you to escape humanity. It wants you to transcend it without abandoning it. And when you finally accept that you cannot save your own loneliness with companionship, you discover an even more bitter truth. You cannot save anyone else either. There's a silent pain that arises after spiritual awakening, the pain of seeing others suffering clearly and realizing there's nothing you can do. You see the wounds in others' eyes, understand their causes, recognize the patterns, and yet everything remains the same. It's brutal, because the healer's ego wants to intervene, wants to rescue, wants to be useful, but the self teaches no one awakens before their time. Jung said that what does not rise to consciousness returns as destiny. And that's exactly it. Each person has the sacred right to repeat their own hell until they recognize it. You can light the way, but you can't carry anyone. Awakening takes away your power to save others. and along with it, strips away the illusion that you could save yourself. It's the collapse of spiritual omnipotence. You try to warn, you try to help, you try to offer what you've learned. And the world returns indifference. It sees you as arrogant, exaggerated, distant. It's the price of lucidity. Because too much awareness is uncomfortable, you realize that others don't reject your truth. They reject the mirror it holds. And that hurts. It hurts to watch the one you love repeat cycles you've already overcome, begging for a pain you've already deciphered. Jung observed that the awakened one feels a double loneliness, that of not being understood and that of being unable to intervene. And this is where true love is born. The love that doesn't demand, doesn't convince, doesn't save. The love that allows the other to fall because it knows that falling is the only path to the self. Spiritual maturity begins when you give up being a savior and learn to be present. When you understand that showing the way is more useful than pushing. When you realize that even pain has a purpose, including your own. If you want to apply this teaching, practice listening without trying to fix. Embrace without correcting, observe without judging, and understand. Even you, awakened, will continue to stumble over the same shadows you've already recognized. Because awakening doesn't make you immune to error. It merely makes you aware of it. And this awareness is unbearable at times, but it is the gateway to surrender. And upon crossing this portal, something new is born, an even more subtle and dangerous enemy, the spiritual ego. No enemy is more seductive than the ego that wears white. After the old ego dies, the new one is born, silent, refined, invisible even to the eyes of the awakened. It speaks of humility, but seeks admiration. It teaches about the shadow, but flees from its own. It quotes Carl Jung, but does so to prove superiority, not to integrate the unconscious. This is the spiritual ego, the shadow that has learned to use mantras. It infiltrates good intentions, phrases of enlightenment, absolute truths. And the more awareness you believe you have, the more it grows. Because the ego doesn't just want to be special, it wants to be special because it doesn't want to be special. It is the psyche's most sophisticated illusion. Jung said that the danger of individuation is confusing the self with the enlightened ego. The difference is subtle, but fatal. The spiritual ego is the architect of the stage. It wants applause disguised as recognition. It wants respect disguised as humility. It meditates, but it doesn't silence. It helps, but it demands reverence, and it convinces you that you've already transcended. This is where awakening becomes a prison. Because while the spiritual ego convinces you that you've arrived, the self watches you, patiently, waiting for you to realize the trick. And the fall is always painful. It comes in the form of shame, exposure, failure. Life humiliates you to restore the truth. And this is grace, not punishment. Every humiliation is a blow to the ego disguised as light. The shadow doesn't disappear when you speak of it. It disappears when you embody it with honesty. And honesty hurts. If you want to practice this, start by observing the hidden motive behind your good deeds. Do you share out of love or out of a need to be seen as someone who loves? Do you teach to help or to feel superior? This constant self-inquiry is what keeps the spirit clean. Carl Jung said that the danger of enlightenment is believing oneself to be enlightened, and that's precisely where awakening stagnates. When the spiritual self becomes identity, you return to sleep, only now with a mystical aura. The true path is disassembly, stripping yourself of even the idea of being awake. And when this last disguise falls, silence returns. But this time, it brings something even more brutal, the realization that awakening never ends. The ego wanted an ending, a certificate of enlightenment, a soul medal, a full stop to the chaos. But the self doesn't operate in endings, it's a spiral. After awakening, there's no rest. There are layers. Each answer opens 10 new questions. Each healing reveals more subtle wounds. Each psychic death paves the way for another. It's the paradox of soul expansion. The higher you climb, the lower there is to descend. Carl Jung said that life is a process of becoming whole, not perfect. And this is the truth the ego can't bear. There is no finish line. Spiritual awakening isn't about reaching the divine, but about learning to live with it within the human. It's infinite, it's exhausting, it's real. Peace exists, but not as a permanent state, but rather as a space between one demolition and the next. Some people give up halfway, tired of the constant self-decomposition. But the self doesn't care about giving up. It waits, because the path is cyclical. You can stop, distract yourself, deny, but sooner or later you'll be pulled back in. It's the nature of consciousness to expand, and the more you understand, the more you realize that nothing can be understood completely. This is the irony of spiritual knowledge. True wisdom destroys the illusion of knowing. Jung saw this in everyone who truly delved. They became more humble, not wiser. Because the vaster the inner universe, the more impossible it is to control. And it's at this point that you learn to dance with the mystery, to trust without understanding, to live without closing down. Awakening, in the end, is a process of unlearning. You unlearn how to defend yourself, how to prove, how to dominate. You even unlearn how to seek. And in this emptying, something new stirs, a serenity that comes not from certainty, but from surrender. You stop trying to arrive and begin to be, and this being becomes the highest form of wisdom. There are no crowns, no end, no diploma, only the continuous movement between shadow and light, between ego and self, between human and divine. It is eternal, it is vast, and yet deeply intimate. The infinity that never ends is not punishment. It is an invitation to remain alive within the mystery. And it is precisely there, at this point of no return, that the story begins again. Perhaps awakening has no sound. Maybe it's just the moment you realize that silence is watching you back. Nothing changes outside, but something inside you breaks. And what flows out is not pain, it is lucidity. You begin to understand that there is no return because there was never any departure. The world remains the same, but you are now the mirror, and every face you meet is just a reflection of what you haven't yet dared to love. Awakening doesn't elevate you, it dismantles you. He doesn't give you peace, he gives you vision, and seeing everything is the punishment and the miracle of conscience. So, if you still want to believe in happy endings, close the video. But if something in you just died while listening, he is. If this burned slowly inside you, sign up now, because this was just the first fire.